For just a second, Victoria hesitated. It was barely noticeable, but David caught it. That tiny pause where she had to think of an answer instead of just stating a fact. "Dr. Peterson," she said quickly. "I've mentioned him before. He's a specialist in geriatric medicine. Very expensive, very exclusive. He only works through referrals." "I want his phone number," David said. Another pause. "I'll have to look it up. I don't have it memorized." Margaret squeezed David's hand tighter. "There is no Dr. Peterson," she whispered. "David, please believe me. I'm telling you the truth." David looked at his mother's desperate face, then at his wife's carefully composed expression, and realized that his whole world was about to fall apart. Because deep down, in a place he had been trying to ignore for months, he was beginning to suspect that his mother was right. David couldn't sleep that night. He lay in bed next to Victoria, staring at the ceiling while his mind raced with questions he was afraid to ask. His wife was sleeping peacefully beside him, breathing softly like nothing had happened. But David felt like his entire world had shifted off its axis in the space of one afternoon. The conversation in the dining room kept playing over and over in his head. The way his mother had looked at him with such desperate hope. The way Victoria had so smoothly transitioned from cruel to caring the moment she realized he was watching. The way Margaret's hands had been steady and strong when she grabbed his, not shaky like someone with declining health. Victoria had handled the rest of the evening perfectly, of course. She had calmly cleaned up the untouched food, helped Margaret to her room for a rest, and made David a cup of coffee while explaining how difficult it was to care for someone with unpredictable behavior. "I didn't want to worry you with all the details," she had said, sitting across from him at the kitchen counter. "Your mother has good days and bad days. Today was one of the harder ones. Sometimes she gets very upset about her limitations and lashes out at the people trying to help her." It had sounded reasonable in the moment. David wanted to believe his wife, wanted to trust that she had been handling a difficult situation as best she could. But now, in the darkness of their bedroom, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. At 4 in the morning, David finally gave up on sleep. He slipped out of bed quietly, grabbed his laptop, and went downstairs to his home office. If Victoria was telling the truth about his mother's condition, there should be medical records, doctor visits, prescriptions. Some kind of paper trail to support everything she had been telling him. David started with their family's medical insurance records. He had access to all the claims and payments through his company's executive health plan. If his mother had been seeing a specialist, if she had been prescribed medications, if she had undergone any kind of medical evaluation, there would be records of it. He searched for Dr. Peterson first. No claims, no payments, no record of Margaret ever seeing anyone by that name. He expanded the search to include any doctor visits at all in the past 6 months. Nothing. According to their insurance company, Margaret had not seen a single medical professional since moving into their house. David felt his stomach twist with unease. Maybe Victoria had been paying for the doctor visits out of pocket to avoid insurance complications. Maybe Dr. Peterson didn't accept their insurance plan. There could be reasonable explanations, but then he searched for prescription medications. The insurance company kept detailed records of every prescription filled under their family plan. If Margaret was taking multiple medications for memory issues and other health problems, there should be a record of those prescriptions. The search came back empty. No prescriptions for Margaret. No medications of any kind. According to their insurance records, his 78-year-old mother was taking no medications at all, which was unusual for someone her age, let alone someone with the serious health issues Victoria had described. David leaned back in his chair, feeling sick. Either Victoria had been lying about everything, or she had been managing his mother's medical care completely outside of their insurance system, paying cash for everything and keeping no records. Given Victoria's usual attention to detail and documentation, the second option seemed highly unlikely. He decided to search for information about the pills Margaret had mentioned. David had never actually seen these medications himself, but Victoria had mentioned them several times over the past few months. She had even shown him a pill organizer once, explaining how complicated it was to keep track of all Margaret's different medicines. Where was that pill organizer now? David realized he had never looked closely at it, never asked to see the actual prescription bottles, never questioned what his mother was taking or why. He had simply trusted Victoria to handle everything. David made his way quietly upstairs and down the hall toward Margaret's room. The house was silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning system. Victoria was still sleeping soundly in their bedroom. Margaret's door was closed, but David could see a thin line of light underneath it. He knocked softly. "Mom, are you awake?" "David?" Margaret's voice came through the door immediately, as if she had been lying there waiting. "Please, come in." David opened the door to find his mother sitting up in bed, fully dressed despite the early hour. She looked like she had been awake all night, her eyes red from crying, but alert and focused. "I knew you would come," she said quietly. "I've been praying you would start asking questions." David sat down in the chair next to her bed. "Mom, I need you to tell me everything. From the beginning. And I need you to be completely honest with me." Margaret took a shaky breath. "Son, I've been trying to tell you the truth for months, but every time I tried, Victoria would interrupt or make excuses or convince you I was confused. I started to think maybe I was going crazy. Maybe I was remembering things wrong." She pointed to the bedside table where David could see the large pill organizer Victoria had shown him before. "Those pills she makes me take every morning? I don't know what they are. I've never been prescribed anything by any doctor. But if I refuse to take them, Victoria tells me I'm being difficult and threatens to tell you I'm not cooperating with my treatment." David opened the pill organizer and examined the contents. There were at least 6 different types of pills and capsules, none of them in original prescription bottles, none of them labeled with information about what they were or who had prescribed them. "Mom, have you been saving these instead of taking them?" Margaret nodded and pointed to a small gap behind her bedside table. "I've been pretending to swallow them, but hiding them instead. I was afraid of what they might be doing to me." David's hands were shaking as he helped his mother move the heavy wooden nightstand. Behind it, tucked into the small space between the furniture and the wall, was a cloth bag containing dozens of pills. Margaret had been collecting evidence of Victoria's deception for months, hiding it like a prisoner planning an escape. "There's more," Margaret whispered, pulling out a small notebook from under her mattress. "I started writing down everything that happened each day because I was afraid I would forget or that people would say I was making things up." David opened the notebook and felt his world collapse around him. Page after page of his mother's careful handwriting documented months of systematic abuse, detailed accounts of Victoria's cruelty when they were alone, descriptions of the restrictions and humiliations, records of phone calls that were intercepted and visitors who were turned away. The entries were dated and specific. Tuesday, March 15th. Victoria told David I was confused about what day it was. I had not asked about the date at all. She also threw away the sandwich I made for lunch and insisted I eat pureed carrots instead. When I protested, she said I was being ungrateful for all the care David was paying for. Friday, March 25th. My friend Janet called to check on me. Victoria answered and told her I was having a bad day and couldn't come to the phone. I was sitting right there, completely fine, wanting to talk to my friend. When I tried to take the phone, Victoria hung up and said Janet didn't want to be bothered with my problems. Monday, April 8th. Victoria showed David pictures of elderly people who had fallen and hurt themselves. She used these to convince him that I shouldn't be allowed to walk outside anymore. She told him I had been dizzy lately. I have not been dizzy. My balance is fine. There were dozens of entries, each one documenting another lie, another manipulation, another freedom taken away. David read page after page of his mother's desperate attempts to maintain her dignity while being systematically torn down by the woman he had trusted to care for, her. The most heartbreaking entries were the ones where Margaret questioned her own perceptions. Maybe I did ask about the date. Maybe I am more confused than I realize. Victoria seems so certain about everything. David believes her completely. Maybe I'm the one who's wrong about what's happening to me. David looked up from the notebook to see his mother watching him anxiously. "You believe me now?" she asked quietly. "Oh, Mom," David said, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry. I'm so incredibly sorry I didn't see this sooner." Margaret started crying then, Not the desperate tears of someone who was being abused, but tears of relief from someone who had finally been heard. "I thought I was going to disappear completely," she whispered. "I thought I was going to forget who I used to be." David hugged his mother tightly, feeling the full weight of his failure to protect her. "We need to gather everything," he said. "All the pills she's been giving you, your notebook, anything else you've been saving. I need to understand exactly what Victoria has been doing." As they worked together in the early morning light, David felt sick thinking about how Victoria must have planned all of this. The systematic isolation, the fake medical concerns, the gradual erosion of his mother's credibility. None of this had been accidental. This had been a deliberate campaign to make Margaret helpless and dependent. But why? What did Victoria have to gain from tormenting an elderly woman? As David helped his mother pack up the evidence of months of abuse, he realized he was about to discover that Victoria's motivations were even more calculating and heartless than he had imagined. The sun was beginning to rise outside Margaret's window, and David knew that Victoria would be waking up soon. He had to decide what to do with the truth he had discovered. His marriage, his family, his entire life was about to change forever. But looking at his mother's face, seeing the hope returning to her eyes for the first time in months, David knew there was only one choice he could make. Margaret had sacrificed everything for him when he was young. Now it was time for him to fight for her. David's phone buzzed with another urgent message from his business partner as he sat in the conference room on Wednesday afternoon. The meeting with their biggest client had been scheduled to run until 6 o'clock, but the client's CEO had to catch an earlier flight. By 3:30, everyone was shaking hands and saying goodbye, leaving David with an unexpected free afternoon. For a moment, he considered going back to his office to catch up on paperwork. His desk was covered with contracts that needed reviewing, and his assistant had scheduled 3 conference calls with their European offices. But something made him hesitate. When was the last time he had gotten home early enough to actually spend time with his mother? The thought hit him like a punch to the stomach. He couldn't remember. Between work obligations and social commitments, David realized he had barely seen Margaret in weeks, except for brief morning greetings and quick goodnight kisses. He was living in the same house as his mother, but hardly knew how she was doing from day to day. Victoria always gave him updates, of course. Just that morning, she had mentioned that Margaret was having a particularly good day, that she had eaten her breakfast without any complaints and seemed more alert than usual. "She was asking about you," Victoria had said with a gentle smile. "I told her how proud you are of her for adapting so well to her new routine." David decided to surprise his mother with an unexpected visit. Maybe they could sit in the garden together, or he could show her some photos from his recent business trip to Chicago. He hadn't shared much about his work with her lately, and he missed their old conversations about his dreams and plans. The drive home through Beverly Hills took longer than usual because of traffic, but David didn't mind. He found himself actually looking forward to an afternoon without meetings or phone calls or urgent decisions. Just him and his mom, like the old days when he would come home from school and tell her about everything that had happened. He pulled into the circular driveway and noticed how quiet the house seemed. Usually there were gardeners working on the lawn or maintenance people coming and going, but today everything was peaceful. David smiled, thinking this would be perfect for a quiet afternoon with Margaret. Instead of calling out when he entered through the front door, David decided to find his mother and surprise her. Victoria had mentioned that Margaret usually spent her afternoons in the small sitting room that overlooked the back garden, so he headed in that direction. But as he walked through the marble hallway, he heard voices coming from the dining room instead. David paused, recognizing Victoria's voice, but not quite catching the words. There was something about her tone that seemed different from the gentle, caring voice she used when he was around. Then he heard his mother's voice, and it stopped him cold. "Please, I'm not sick. I can feed myself. I don't want to eat that mush." David had never heard his mother sound so desperate, so defeated. Margaret had always been a strong woman, even in her 70s. She had opinions about everything and wasn't shy about expressing them. But the voice he heard now sounded broken, almost pleading. "Now, Mother Margaret, we've talked about this," Victoria replied, and David could hear the sharp edge beneath her patient tone. "Dr. Peterson was very clear about your dietary restrictions. You know you have trouble swallowing regular food." "I don't have trouble swallowing," Margaret said, her voice getting stronger with frustration. "There's nothing wrong with my throat. I've been eating normal food my whole life." "Why are you doing this to me?" David felt his heart start to race. This conversation didn't sound anything like the peaceful, caring environment Victoria always described. His mother sounded upset, almost frightened, while Victoria sounded like she was arguing with a stubborn child. He moved closer to the dining room doorway, staying out of sight but positioning himself where he could see what was happening. What he saw made his stomach drop. Margaret was sitting at the large dining table, but she looked smaller than David remembered, almost frail. Her usually neat hair was messy, and she was wearing a robe instead of the nice clothes she normally preferred. In front of her was a plate of what looked like baby food, colorless mush that bore no resemblance to an actual meal. Victoria was standing over her with a spoon, trying to force Margaret to eat. But this wasn't the gentle, caring assistance David had imagined. Victoria's face was hard with annoyance, and she was gripping Margaret's wrist with one hand while trying to push the spoon toward her mouth with the other. "Open your mouth," Victoria said through gritted teeth. "Stop being so difficult. Your son is paying good money for this specialized nutrition." "David doesn't know what you're doing to me," Margaret whispered, tears running down her cheeks. "He doesn't know you're treating me like this." Victoria laughed, a cold sound that made David's skin crawl. "David trusts me completely. Even if you tried to tell him, who do you think he would believe? His loving wife? Or a confused old woman who can't even remember what day it is?" David felt like he was watching a stranger. This wasn't the woman he had married, the woman who had seemed so excited to welcome his mother into their home. This was someone cruel and manipulative, someone who was taking pleasure in making his mother feel helpless. Margaret tried to pull her wrist away, but Victoria tightened her grip. "Let go of me," Margaret said, her voice getting louder. "I want to call my son. I want to tell him what you're really like." "Go ahead and try," Victoria sneered. "I'll just tell him you're having another one of your episodes." Poor confused Margaret, making up stories again because she can't handle the reality of getting older. David had heard enough. His whole body was shaking with anger and disbelief as he stepped into the dining room. Both women looked up at him in shock, but their reactions couldn't have been more different. Margaret's face lit up with relief and hope. "David, oh, thank God you're here. Please, you have to listen to me. She's been—" But Victoria was already transforming back into the caring wife David thought he knew. Her grip on Margaret's wrist loosened immediately, and her expression shifted from cruel annoyance to loving concern. "David, honey, what are you doing home so early?" Victoria said with a bright smile. "Mother Margaret is having one of her difficult days. She's refusing to eat the special diet the doctor ordered, and she's been saying some very hurtful things." Margaret looked desperately at her son. "David, please. I'm not confused. I don't need pureed food. She's been lying to you about everything. I'm not sick. I don't have memory problems, and I can take care of myself." Victoria shook her head sadly and gave David a look that said, "See what I have to deal with?" Out loud, she said, "Sweetie, your mother has been getting more agitated lately. Sometimes elderly people become paranoid and start believing that the people caring for them are trying to hurt them. It's actually very common." David looked back and forth between the two women, his mind racing. Everything Victoria was saying sounded reasonable, like the kind of thing he had read about in articles about aging and dementia. But the scene he had witnessed didn't match Victoria's explanation at all. Margaret reached across the table and grabbed David's hand with both of hers. Her grip was strong and steady, not the shaky hands of someone who was declining mentally. "Son, look at me," she said, her voice clear and urgent. "Really look at me. Do I seem confused to you right now? Do I seem like someone who doesn't know what's happening around her?" David stared into his mother's eyes. They were bright and focused, full of intelligence and awareness. These weren't the eyes of someone who was losing her mind. These were the same eyes that had helped him with homework, that had encouraged him through every challenge, that had always seen right through any lie he tried to tell as a child. I don't understand, David said slowly. Victoria, you told me Mom was having memory issues. You said the doctor recommended this special diet. Victoria's smile never wavered, but David caught a flash of something dangerous in her eyes. Darling, your mother is having what's called a lucid moment. Sometimes people with cognitive decline can seem perfectly normal for short periods. It doesn't mean they're actually better. But Margaret wasn't letting go of David's hand. What doctor? She demanded. Ask her what doctor? Ask her when I supposedly saw this doctor because I've never met with anyone. Ask her to show you the prescription for those pills she makes me take every day. David felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. For months, he had trusted Victoria to manage his mother's care. He had been grateful to have a wife who was so attentive and knowledgeable about elderly health issues. But now, looking at the scene in front of him, he realized he had never actually verified any of the information Victoria had given him. Victoria, he said carefully. What's the name of Mom's doctor? I'd like to call and discuss her treatment plan. Look at this article I found, Victoria would say, showing Margaret newspaper clippings about elderly people who had fallen and injured themselves. And here's a medical study about how common balance problems are for people over 75. We just can't take any chances with your safety. The beautiful gardens outside the mansion became another thing Margaret could only look at through the window. The neighborhood streets where she might have met other walkers became forbidden territory. Even the mailbox at the end of the driveway was declared too far and too dangerous for her to visit. Margaret spent her days sitting in rooms that felt more like museum displays than living spaces. She ate food she didn't choose, took pills she didn't understand, and followed routines that someone else had designed for her. The woman who had once managed a classroom full of teenagers, who had balanced 2 jobs and a household budget, who had raised a successful son on her own, was being treated like someone who couldn't be trusted to cross a room safely. The worst part was the constant questioning of her own perceptions. Victoria was so skilled at twisting conversations that Margaret often found herself apologizing for things she hadn't done and accepting restrictions she didn't need. The confident teacher who had once commanded respect from students, parents, and colleagues was slowly disappearing, replaced by a confused old woman who couldn't trust her own memories. Late at night, Margaret would lie in her beautiful prison of a bedroom and try to remember who she used to be. She would close her eyes and picture her old classroom, her old apartment, her old life where she made her own decisions and controlled her own destiny. But those memories felt increasingly distant, like scenes from someone else's life. Victoria's version of reality was becoming the only truth Margaret was allowed to know. And with each passing day, Margaret felt herself fading away, becoming the helpless, confused, elderly woman that Victoria insisted she had always been. The isolation was complete. Margaret was surrounded by people, nurses, housekeepers, Victoria herself, but she had never felt more alone. She was living in a house full of voices, but no one was listening to hers. The changes started small, so small that Margaret almost didn't notice them at first. It was like watching the seasons change. You don't see it happening day by day, but suddenly you realize summer has turned into winter and you're not sure exactly when it happened. It began with Margaret's morning routine. For 60 years, she had started every day the same way, a cup of coffee, black with 1 sugar, while reading the newspaper from front to back. She would sit at whatever table she had, whether it was the wobbly one in her old apartment or now the marble dining table in the mansion, and catch up on what was happening in the world. But one morning, about 3 months after moving in, Victoria appeared with a cup of herbal tea instead of coffee. I've been reading about the effects of caffeine on older adults, Victoria said with that bright smile she always wore. Coffee can interfere with sleep patterns and increase anxiety. This chamomile tea will be so much better for you. Margaret stared at the pale yellow liquid in the delicate china cup. I've been drinking coffee for 60 years, she said quietly. It's never interfered with my sleep. Victoria laughed, the kind of laugh you give a child who says something cute but silly. Oh, Mother Margaret, our bodies change as we age. What worked when you were younger might not be best for you now. Trust me, you'll feel so much better without all that caffeine. The newspaper disappeared next. Margaret looked for it every morning, but when she asked about it, Victoria explained that they had canceled the subscription. All that negative news isn't good for anyone, especially someone your age, Victoria said. Why fill your mind with stories about crime and politics and war? It's just depressing. I've subscribed to some lovely magazines for you instead. Better Homes and Gardens, Good Housekeeping, much more uplifting content. Margaret wanted to argue that she had been a high school English teacher, that she was used to discussing complex topics, that she wanted to know what was happening in the world. But something in Victoria's tone made her hesitate. There was a firmness beneath the sweetness, a warning that questioning these decisions would not be welcome. The magazines Victoria chose were filled with recipes Margaret would never cook, decorating tips for homes she would never own, and advice for a life she was no longer allowed to live. She flipped through them politely, but felt like she was slowly starving for real information, real content, real connection to the world beyond these marble walls. Margaret's books were the next target. She had always been a reader. Mysteries, biographies, classic literature, anything she could get her hands on. Over the years, she had collected hundreds of books, each one an old friend she could revisit whenever she wanted. "This house is so beautiful," Victoria said one afternoon, looking around Margaret's room with a critical eye. "But all these old books are making it look cluttered. And think about the dust they collect. That can't be good for your breathing." Before Margaret could protest, Victoria had called in a cleaning service. They packed up box after box of Margaret's beloved books, promising they would be properly stored in the basement. Margaret watched helplessly as her entire library disappeared, leaving her room looking like a hotel suite, beautiful but completely impersonal. "I kept a few for you," Victoria said generously, pointing to a small stack of large print romance novels on the bedside table. "These will be easier on your eyes, and they're not too challenging or upsetting." Margaret picked up one of the books and nearly cried. She had been reading graduate-level literature for decades. She had taught Shakespeare and Dickens and Morrison to teenagers. Now she was expected to be satisfied with simple love stories written for people who couldn't handle complex plots. But the cruelest cut came when Victoria started interfering with Margaret's friendships. Margaret had maintained close relationships with several of her former teaching colleagues. These women had shared decades of their lives together. They had supported each other through divorces and deaths, celebrated each other's children's achievements, and grown old together with grace and humor. Every Tuesday for 15 years, Margaret had lunch with her friend Janet. Every Thursday evening, she talked on the phone with Rose, who lived across the country but had been her closest friend since their first year of teaching. On weekends, she would sometimes meet with her book club, a group of 6 women who had been reading together for over 20 years. Victoria began sabotaging these connections with surgical precision. When Janet called to confirm their Tuesday lunch, Victoria would answer the phone. "Oh, I'm so sorry, Janet, but Mother Margaret is having one of her difficult days. She's been very confused lately, asking the same questions over and over. I don't think she's up for visitors right now." Margaret would be sitting right there, perfectly alert and desperately wanting to talk to her friend. But Victoria would hang up before Margaret could get to the phone. When Margaret protested, Victoria would look concerned and say, "Sweetheart, you were just asking me what day it was 10 minutes ago. Maybe it's better if you rest today instead of trying to keep up with social obligations." The gaslighting was so subtle, so consistent, that Margaret began to doubt her own memory. Had she asked what day it was? She didn't remember doing that, but Victoria seemed so certain. Maybe she was more confused than she realized. The phone calls with Rose were next. Victoria would interrupt these conversations with urgent but fake emergencies. "Mother Margaret, I'm so sorry, but the nurse needs to check your blood pressure right now. Can you call Rose back later?" Of course, later never came, and eventually Rose stopped calling as often. The book club was the hardest loss of all. These 6 women had been Margaret's intellectual lifeline, the place where she could discuss ideas and share thoughts about literature and life. Victoria eliminated this group with characteristic efficiency. "I'm concerned about you driving to these meetings," Victoria told Margaret one day. "Your reflexes aren't what they used to be, and some of the medications you're taking can cause dizziness." "What if you had an accident?" "David would never forgive himself if something happened to you." Margaret wasn't taking any medications that caused dizziness. She wasn't taking any medications at all, except for the vitamins Victoria insisted she swallow every morning. But when she said this, Victoria pulled out a pill organizer filled with various capsules and tablets. "The doctor prescribed these for your memory and overall health," Victoria explained patiently. "I've been managing your medications because keeping track of all these pills can be confusing. See how many there are? It's important that you take them exactly as prescribed." Margaret had never seen these pills before, had never met with any doctor who prescribed them. But Victoria spoke with such authority that Margaret began to question her own memory again. Maybe she had forgotten about a doctor's visit. Maybe she was sicker than she realized. Victoria called Margaret's book club friends and explained that Margaret was going through some health challenges and wouldn't be able to continue with their meetings. "She's so embarrassed about her memory issues," Victoria confided to the group leader. "She asked me to call because she was too upset to do it herself. She hopes you all understand." One by one, Margaret's connections to the outside world were severed. Her friends received the message that she was declining and didn't want visitors. They respected what they thought were her wishes and stopped reaching out. Margaret found herself more isolated each day, surrounded by luxury but starved of the human connections that had always given her life. Meaning, the final blow came when Victoria announced that Margaret's daily walks were no longer safe. "The doctor says your balance isn't stable enough for you to be walking around the neighborhood alone," Victoria explained. "What if you fell and broke a hip? At your age, that could be life-threatening." Margaret's balance was fine. She had been walking for exercise her entire adult life and had never had a serious fall. But Victoria was relentless in her campaign of manufactured concern. David Wilson sat in his corner office on the 32nd floor, looking out at the city skyline as the sun began to set. At 52, he had everything most people could only dream of. His tech company had just signed another multi-million-dollar deal. His bank account had more zeros than he could have imagined as a kid, and his beautiful wife was waiting for him at home in their mansion. But sometimes, late at night when he couldn't sleep, David would remember the cramped apartment where he grew up. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and a kitchen so small that only one person could stand in it at a time. His mother, Margaret, would cook dinner on a tiny stove while he did his homework at a wobbly table that she had bought at a garage sale. Those were hard times, but looking back, David realized they might have been the happiest years of his life. It was just him and his mom against the world. She worked 2 jobs, teaching during the day and cleaning offices at night, just to make sure he had everything he needed. She never complained, never made him feel like he was a burden, even though he knew money was always tight. When other kids had new clothes and expensive toys, David wore hand-me-downs and played with whatever his mother could afford. But Margaret made sure he never felt poor. She would take him to the library every Saturday, where books were free and dreams were unlimited. She would help him with his math homework even though she was exhausted from working 14-hour days. "Education is your ticket out of here," she would tell him. "Study hard, work harder, and you can be anything you want to be." David took those words to heart. He got good grades, earned a scholarship to college, and started his first tech company right after graduation. The early years were tough, sleeping on friends' couches, eating ramen noodles for dinner, and working 18-hour days to get his business off the ground. But Margaret never stopped believing in him. When investors turned him down, she would listen to his frustrated phone calls and remind him that every successful person faced rejection. When he wanted to give up, she would drive across town to his tiny office and bring him homemade sandwiches and encouragement. The breakthrough came 5 years ago. David's company developed a software program that revolutionized how businesses manage their data. Suddenly, everyone wanted what he was selling. The offers started pouring in. From investors, from bigger companies, from clients who were willing to pay millions for his product. Within 2 years, David went from struggling entrepreneur to multimillionaire. The money came so fast it almost felt unreal. He bought the mansion in Beverly Hills, the expensive cars, the designer suits. But the first thing he wanted to do was take care of his mother. Margaret was still living in that same small apartment downtown. She was 76 then, still independent but getting older. David would lie awake at night thinking about all the sacrifices she had made for him. While he was sleeping in silk sheets, his mother was still using the same old blankets she'd had for 20 years. "Mom, you don't have to work anymore," he told her during one of his visits. "You don't have to worry about money ever again. Let me take care of you the way you took care of me." At first, Margaret resisted. She was proud of her independence, proud of the life she had built for herself. But David could be very persuasive, and he could see that she was getting tired. The long years of working 2 jobs and raising a child alone were catching up with her. The mansion had plenty of room, and David genuinely wanted his mother close by. He had married Victoria 2 years earlier, and she seemed excited about the idea of having Margaret live with them. Victoria talked about how wonderful it would be to have a mother figure in the house, how she looked forward to taking care of David's mom. "She raised the most amazing man," Victoria would say, squeezing David's hand. "I want to give her the luxury and comfort she deserves after all those years of struggle." David fell for it completely. He was so grateful to have a wife who understood how important his mother was to him. Not every woman would welcome their mother-in-law into their home, but Victoria seemed genuinely enthusiastic about it. Looking back now, David realized he should have paid more attention to the details. He should have noticed that Victoria's enthusiasm was a little too perfect, a little too rehearsed. But he was working 70 to 80 hours a week, trying to manage his rapidly growing company, and he trusted his wife to handle the domestic arrangements. The first few months after Margaret moved in seemed to go smoothly. When David asked how his mother was adjusting, Victoria always had positive things to say. Margaret was settling in beautifully. She was so grateful for everything. She was adjusting to the luxury lifestyle better than expected. But David was rarely home to see for himself. His company was expanding internationally, which meant conference calls with Tokyo at 5 in the morning and video meetings with London at 10 at night. He would leave for work before his mother woke up and come home after she had gone to bed. On weekends, when he did see Margaret, she seemed quieter than usual. When he asked if everything was okay, she would glance at Victoria and then nod quickly, saying she was fine, just tired. David assumed she was still adjusting to her new surroundings. Victoria was always quick to explain any concerns. "Your mother had a little confusion yesterday," she would whisper to David after dinner. "She couldn't remember where she put her purse, and she asked me 3 times what day it was. I think the move might be affecting her more than she wants to admit." These little reports worried David, but Victoria always reassured him that it was normal for elderly people to have some confusion when their routine changed. She had done research, she said. She had talked to doctors. Everything Margaret was experiencing was completely expected for someone her age. "The important thing is that she's safe and comfortable," Victoria would say. "We're giving her the best care possible. She doesn't have to worry about cooking or cleaning or paying bills. She can just relax and enjoy her golden years." It sounded reasonable to David. His mother had worked hard her entire life. She deserved to be pampered and taken care of. If she was having some minor memory issues, well, that was just part of getting older. At least she was in a place where she would be looked after properly. Victoria started suggesting that they hire professional help. "Your mother needs more specialized care than I can provide," she explained. "I've found some wonderful nurses who work specifically with elderly clients. They understand the unique challenges that come with aging." David was impressed by how thoughtful Victoria was being. She researched care facilities, interviewed potential nurses, and consulted with doctors about the best ways to help elderly family members. She presented him with detailed reports about Margaret's needs and carefully planned solutions for every concern. "I want to make sure we're doing everything right," Victoria would say. "Your mother sacrificed so much for you. We owe it to her to give her the absolute best care available." The nurses Victoria hired were professional and experienced. They came with excellent references and impressive qualifications. They specialized in elderly care, particularly for clients who were experiencing cognitive decline. David felt relieved knowing that his mother was in such capable hands, but he was too busy to notice that these nurses always seemed to agree with everything Victoria said. They confirmed her reports about Margaret's confusion. supported her suggestions for dietary changes, and validated her concerns about Margaret's safety and well-being. David trusted these professionals completely. Why wouldn't he? They were experts in their field, and they had no reason to lie about his mother's condition. When they recommended that Margaret's activities be limited for her own safety, David agreed without question. When Victoria suggested that Margaret's phone calls should be monitored because she was sometimes confused and might say things that weren't accurate, David thought it made sense. When she recommended that visitors be restricted because too much stimulation could be overwhelming for someone Margaret's age, David supported the decision. Every suggestion seemed reasonable when Victoria explained it. Every restriction seemed necessary when the nurses backed it up. David was working so much that he didn't have time to question the details. He was just grateful that his wife cared enough to manage everything for him. The irony was that David thought he was being the perfect son. He was providing his mother with luxury, professional care, and complete financial security. He was giving her everything money could buy. In his mind, he was finally repaying her for all those years of sacrifice. What David didn't realize was that in trying to give his mother everything, he was actually taking away the one thing she valued most, her freedom. And the woman he trusted to care for Margaret was systematically destroying the independent spirit that had raised him to be successful in the first place. But David was too busy building his empire to see what was happening in his own home. He was too focused on making money to notice that his mother was losing herself. And Victoria was very, very good at making sure he stayed focused on everything except the truth. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the Beverly Hills mansion, casting long shadows across the polished marble floor. But Margaret Wilson barely noticed the beauty around her anymore. At 78 years old, she sat at the huge dining table that could easily seat 12 people, yet she had never felt more alone. The plate in front of her contained what looked like baby food. Mashed carrots, pureed peas, and some kind of mushy protein that she couldn't even identify. Her hands, though slightly wrinkled with age, were perfectly steady. Her mind was sharp as ever. Yet here she was, being served food that belonged in a nursery. "I don't want to eat that," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible in the grand dining room. The words came out like a prayer, desperate and hopeless. Victoria stood nearby, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against her crossed arms. At 45, she was a stunning woman who knew how to use her looks to get what she wanted. Her blonde hair was styled in an expensive cut, and her designer dress probably cost more than most people made in a month. "Now, Mother Margaret," Victoria said with fake sweetness, the kind of voice you'd use with a difficult child. "Dr. Peterson said you need soft foods. Your digestion isn't what it used to be," Margaret wanted to scream. There was nothing wrong with her digestion. She had been eating regular food just fine until 6 months ago, when Victoria decided she needed special care. But every time she tried to argue, Victoria would just shake her head and make that clicking sound with her tongue, like she was dealing with someone who had lost their mind. The truth was, Margaret's mind was perfectly clear. Too clear, perhaps. She could see exactly what was happening to her, but she felt powerless to stop it. This beautiful mansion, with its crystal chandeliers and expensive paintings, had become her prison, and Victoria was her warden. Just 2 years ago, Margaret had been living in her own small apartment downtown. It wasn't fancy, but it was hers. She had her routine: morning coffee while reading the newspaper, afternoon walks in the park, evening phone calls with her old teaching friends. She cooked her own meals, chose her own clothes, and made her own decisions. She was independent and proud of it. Then her son David started making more money than anyone could spend in a lifetime. His tech company had exploded, and suddenly he was worth $50 million. Margaret was proud of him, of course. She remembered those hard years when it was just the two of them in a tiny apartment, when she worked 2 jobs to make sure he had everything he needed. David never forgot where he came from. When his business started taking off, the first thing he wanted to do was take care of his mother. "Mom, you raised me by yourself," he had said. "You sacrificed everything for me. Now it's my turn to take care of you." At first, the idea of living with David and Victoria seemed wonderful. The mansion was beautiful, and Margaret thought she would enjoy spending more time with her son. She imagined family dinners, long conversations, maybe even helping with grandchildren someday. But things started changing almost immediately. Victoria had opinions about everything Margaret did. Her clothes were too outdated for someone living in such a nice house. Her books were cluttering up the beautiful rooms. Her old friends were not the right sort of people to be visiting such an exclusive neighborhood. One by one, Margaret's freedoms disappeared. First, Victoria suggested she should eat healthier food. Then she said Margaret's hands were too shaky to cook safely. Soon, all of Margaret's meals were being prepared by Victoria or the hired cook, with no input from Margaret about what she wanted to eat. The phone calls to her friends became difficult too. Victoria would interrupt, saying Margaret needed her rest or that she was having one of her confused days and shouldn't be talking to people. Margaret tried to explain that she wasn't confused at all. But Victoria would just give her that patient smile and speak to her like she was a child who didn't understand. The worst part was watching her son believe every word Victoria said. David worked such long hours that he rarely saw his mother except for brief visits. And during those visits, Victoria was always there, subtly controlling the conversation, making little comments about Margaret's condition that weren't true but sounded believable. "She's been having some memory issues," Victoria would whisper to David while Margaret sat right there. "Yesterday, she forgot where she put her glasses 3 times, and she's been asking me the same questions over and over." Margaret wanted to shout that she had never asked the same question twice, that her glasses had been moved by Victoria herself, that her memory was fine. But when she tried to defend herself, Victoria would look at David with raised eyebrows as if to say, "See what I mean?" Slowly but surely, Margaret realized that no one was going to believe her. Her son trusted his wife completely. The staff in the house were paid by Victoria. Her old friends stopped calling because Victoria told them Margaret was declining and not up for visitors. Now, 6 months later, Margaret felt like she was disappearing. The woman who had once taught high school English to hundreds of students, who had raised a successful son on her own, who had traveled and read and lived a full life. That woman was being erased bit by bit. The pureed food was just the latest humiliation. Margaret knew there was nothing wrong with her ability to chew or swallow. She had eaten a perfectly normal breakfast at her old apartment just 6 months ago, but now Victoria insisted that anything with texture was dangerous for someone Margaret's age. "Please," Margaret said, looking at the mushy pile on her plate. "I'm not sick. I can eat regular food." "I've been eating regular food for 78 years, Victoria sighed dramatically. "Mother Margaret, I know this is hard for you to understand, but your son is paying for the best care money can buy. Dr. Peterson is a specialist in elderly nutrition. He knows what's best for you." Margaret had never met Dr. Peterson. She suspected he might not even exist. But every time she asked to see him herself, Victoria had an excuse. He was too busy. He only consulted with family members. Margaret wasn't well enough for the trip to his office. The isolation was the hardest part. Margaret had always been social. As a teacher, she was surrounded by people all day. Even in retirement, she had maintained close friendships with her former colleagues. They would meet for lunch, go to movies together, take day trips to museums or gardens. Now her days stretched endlessly with nothing to fill them. Victoria had decided that television was too stimulating for Margaret's condition. Most of her books had been packed away because they were collecting dust and creating allergens. The beautiful gardens outside were declared unsafe for someone who might fall. Margaret spent most of her time sitting in the living room, staring out the window at a world she was no longer allowed to be part of. Sometimes she would see neighbors walking their dogs or children playing in the street, and she would remember what it felt like to have freedom. The worst moments came at night, when she lay in the guest bedroom that Victoria had decorated for her. It was beautiful, of course, silk curtains, expensive furniture, fresh flowers every week, but it didn't feel like home. It felt like a very pretty cage. Margaret would lie there, remembering her old life, wondering how everything had changed so quickly. She thought about her son, working late in his office, believing he was giving his mother the best possible life. She thought about Victoria, probably planning some new way to make Margaret feel smaller and more helpless. And she wondered if this was how the rest of her life would be, sitting at that marble table, refusing to eat baby food while everyone around her pretended it was for her own good. The saddest part was that Margaret could see exactly how this would end. Victoria would gradually convince everyone that Margaret was becoming more and more difficult. Eventually, there would be talk of a care facility, somewhere even more isolated than this mansion. And Margaret would disappear completely, leaving behind only the memory of a woman who had once been strong and independent. As she stared at the pureed vegetables growing cold on her plate, Margaret made a decision. She couldn't keep living like this. Somehow, she had to find a way to show her son what was really happening, before it was too late. Before she forgot who she used to be. But first, she had to survive another day in her golden cage.